Let's imagine for a second, what if you could design a perfect society totally from scratch? A place where justice was basically guaranteed and the absolute smartest people were in charge. Well, that's exactly what the ancient Greek philosopher Plato tried to do. Today, we're diving into his radical blueprint for a perfect world, and we're going to see why his ideas are still so incredibly controversial more than 2,000 years later. So to really get Plato, you first have to understand the one event that completely shattered his world: the death of his teacher, Socrates. And this quote gets right to the heart of Socrates' thinking. He believed that things we normally think are good, like being brave or rich, are only good if you have the wisdom to use them correctly. Without wisdom, courage is just recklessness, and wealth is just a tool for greed. And here's the kicker. Athens, the so-called birthplace of democracy, is the city that condemned Socrates, its wisest citizen, to death. And why? For questioning authority, for pushing people to think for themselves. For Plato, this was an absolute disaster. It created this one burning question in his mind. How in the world do you build a society so just, so stable, that it would never, ever again kill its best and brightest minds? Okay, so here's our game plan for getting inside Plato's head. First, we'll look at why Athens turned on its most famous gadfly. Then, we're going beyond the shadows to get a grip on his core philosophy. After that, we'll dig into his actual blueprint for a state, including the really wild stuff, like getting rid of private property and the family. We'll also check out his surprisingly modern take on equality, before we ask the big question: is this whole thing a utopia or a total nightmare? So, faced with the mess of Athenian politics, where did Plato even start? Well, he argued that before we can fix the real world, we first have to understand reality itself. His solution wasn't just to tweak a few laws. It was a complete philosophical overhaul, starting from the ground up. And this brings us to what is probably Plato's most famous and, kind of mind-bending idea, the theory of forms. He basically said that the world we see, hear, and touch, it isn't the real world. It's more like a flickering shadow, a cheap copy of a higher, perfect, and eternal reality. A reality he called the world of forms. Okay, here's an easy way to think about it. In our world, the physical world, we can see a beautiful flower. But that flower will wilt and die. It's imperfect and temporary. But in the world of forms, there's the perfect, eternal idea of beauty itself. The same thing applies to justice. We might pass a law that's kind of just, but it's always flawed. Plato believed that the perfect form of justice exists out there in this higher realm, and you can only grasp it with your mind, not with your senses. So, armed with this whole philosophy of forms, Plato set out to design his ideal state. This wasn't going to be a society based on who has the most money or the biggest army or whose dad was king. No, this state was going to be founded on one thing: knowledge of the good, a true understanding of those perfect forms. Now, this is absolutely crucial to understand. When Plato talks about justice, he's not really talking about courtrooms and lawyers. For him, justice is about societal harmony. Think of a just state like a perfectly healthy body. The heart does its job, the lungs do their job, the brain does its job, and because every part is doing what it's best suited for, the whole body thrives. It's all about order, balance, and everyone sticking to their role. And to get that perfect harmony, Plato divides his ideal society into three very strict classes. Down at the bottom, you have the producers. These are your farmers, your craftsmen, the people who make everything the state needs. Then you have the auxiliaries, the warrior class, whose job is to protect the state. And at the very top, ruling with pure wisdom, you have the philosopher kings, the only ones who have true knowledge of the forms. Okay, so how do you decide who gets to be a worker, a warrior, or a ruler? It's not based on who your parents were. It all comes down to a really revolutionary state-controlled education system. This thing was mandatory for everyone. And get this, for both boys and girls. The entire point of this education was to figure out what each kid's natural talents were, and then train them for their proper role in society. But Plato knew that even with all this training, you still had to deal with the biggest source of corruption out there: personal greed and self-interest. And his solution to this problem is where his blueprint goes from being radical to being, well, truly shocking. I mean, Plato was wrestling with a question that is just as relevant today as it was back then. How do you stop the people in power from using their position to get rich and help out their friends and family? His answer was extreme, to say the least. His solution was a kind of communism, but, and this is a huge but, it was only for the ruling classes, the guardians. They were forbidden from owning any private property. No land, no fancy houses, no money. And even crazier, the traditional family was completely abolished. Mates would be chosen by the state, like a breeding program, and all the children would be raised together by the community, with no one knowing who their biological parents were. The goal was to completely wipe out personal loyalties, greed, and nepotism. Now, it is so important to be clear here. This is not the communism you might be thinking of, like from Karl Marx. It's a totally different animal. As you can see, Plato's version was a political tool for the elite, not an economic system for everybody. The goal was to keep the rulers pure, not to create a classless society. In fact, the producer class could still own private property. But tucked away inside this incredibly rigid and, let's face it, kind of terrifying social structure is one of Plato's most revolutionary and forward-thinking ideas, and it has to do with the role of women. This was a massive break from ancient Greek society, where women were basically confined to the home. Plato just comes right out and says that in his ideal state, a person's gender is completely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the quality of your soul, your intellect. If your soul is fit to rule, your sex just doesn't matter. You see, Plato's logic here was actually pretty simple. If a woman has the mind of a ruler and the courage of a warrior, why on earth should her body stop her from doing that job? This idea that women could be guardians, rulers, even philosopher queens, was a direct attack on the patriarchy of Athens, and it's a huge reason why some people look back and say, wow, maybe Plato was the very first feminist. So after going through this whole intricate, radical, and pretty wild design, what are we supposed to make of it? What is the legacy of Plato's blueprint for a perfect world? Is it an inspiring ideal, or is it a totalitarian nightmare waiting to happen? It is almost impossible to overstate Plato's influence. He's often called the father of political philosophy for a reason. He basically set the terms of the debate for the next 2 millennia. He's the ultimate idealist, arguing that politics should be about striving for perfection, not just managing a messy reality. And of course, his vision of a perfectly engineered state has been a double-edged sword, inspiring both beautiful utopian dreams and the blueprints for some of history's worst dystopian nightmares. And that brings us to the fundamental challenge that Plato leaves us with. His entire system is built on this one core belief, that knowledge is virtue, and so the wisest among us should rule. But who are the wise ones in our modern world? Scientists, philosophers, tech billionaires? And even if we could somehow agree on who they are, would we or should we ever trust them with that much power? That is Plato's enduring question, and it's one we are still grappling with today.